Okay, so we're now going to move on to several aspects of global strategy, and I'm just going to kind of go. The book is a little bit theoretical here, so I'm just going to try and go through them briefly and try and give an example or two for each of them. So the first of these is global industry, and most important is the degree of globalization and how competitive position in one country is affected by its position in other countries. So my example here is supermarkets. So Walmart is the leader in the US and it generates lots of cash from the US. So when it moves into a new market, for example, Brazil, it can generally cross-subsidize its new operations by utilizing money from the US because the US is such a large market. So in a way, Walmart, they come into a market, they can mess up for a while and it can take them a while to get profitable, but eventually they can use their finances to succeed. Another interesting one is the NFL. And when I was a kid, NFL was made a big push towards the European market. And they actually had a starter league in Europe. They had games played. And then that kind of all faded away a little bit. But they've made a new push to build fans in different markets. So again, they have this. The strength is that they're a US-focused league, but they're beginning to try to think a little bit about, how do we build our brand in different countries? And it's a little bit harder than, say, soccer because there's no kind of organic kind of structure in a lot of these countries. So that's, again, another good example of how different kind of industries work differently across the globe. So here's another little example. This is Honda. As I said, most car companies are pretty international. We've already talked a little bit about Honda's problems in Europe, but Honda actually, they're known for their small cars in Japan, and they have a strength in that segment of the market. And what they've done is that, GM is a major global firm, but maybe didn't quite have the strength in the small car arena. So Honda and GM have kind of built a strategic alliance where they can kind of begin to think about, designing smaller cars together. Okay, so the book mentions 4 different forces that are driving globalization. And market forces, cost forces, government forces, and competition forces. So again, I'm going to give an example for each of these. So here's a nice little diagram with all these forces affecting globalization. And, there will be quite a few exam questions on this. So you do know which forces are which type of forces. I might give you something and I'll say, is it a market force, a cost force, competitive force, or government force? These things are kind of made for multiple choice questions. Okay, so if I'm Starbucks, and Starbucks have begun their global expansion after saturating the US market, what makes market forces in the coffee arena towards globalization? Well, we've got per capita income convergence. More people in poorer countries can afford Starbucks, and we've got these richer consumers in emerging markets. As we've talked a lot about in this class, we've got this convergence of lifestyle and taste. A lot of people exposed to American culture might want the American tradition of having a coffee in the morning, or meeting up with friends to study, or just to chat over coffee. Not so much for Starbucks, but again, in terms of Starbucks being able to communicate with one another internally and push marketing campaigns and social media across cultures, growth in communications. Global consumers will probably have a lot of knowledge about Starbucks, even if Starbucks is not already there. It's not really B2B, so that's not really applicable. It's not an organization. Growth of global and regional channels, i.e., there's probably much more global kind of coffee market. There's B2B websites selling coffee, B2B exchanges selling coffee. Starbucks is very much a world brand. And again, if people consume any sort of US media, most US news organizations or what news sites are watched all over the world, they'll have probably heard of Starbucks. Okay, so the next example is of cost forces, and I'm going to go back to the car industry. Because in order to get economies of scale and economies of scope, we have these kind of global alliances. We have Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. We have GM and Honda. And basically, it's actually very expensive to build and design new cars. So these manufacturers can work together to have a standard platform. They'll obviously have slight differences in their actual own brands, but they can have standard platforms to develop new technology, develop more fuel efficient cars, develop electric cars, and kind of share those costs. Advances in transportation, and that's, we're shipping cars all over the world. Advances in logistics can only be a good thing. And quite often, not always, but, for example, a lot of the low-end cars in the US are built in Mexico. So we've got a country, we've got a high degrees of expertise in the car industry in Mexico, but has relatively low-cost labor relative to the US. Okay, so the third example is government forces. We've talked about in previous classes, the reduction of tariffs. We've talked about trade blocks like, NAFTA, and more complex blocks like the European Union. And this idea of deregulation and privatization that, and previously maybe more socialist economies becoming more open markets. So I'll just kind of give you like a little almost board example for that. Okay, so we're going to start off with my map of the UK. And I think if anybody saw my map of the UK, I might actually lose my citizenship. That's not one of the better maps of the UK, will say. But the UK up to the 80s was quite, a regulatory, very strong market with very strong regulation. A lot of the market was owned by the government. One example of that, and for example, a lot of the power companies were owned by the government. A lot of transportation companies were owned by the government. And there's been a degree of privatization and deregulation. For example, these big utilities like the gas companies, they have been privatized. The government sold shares in them. The rail industry has been privatized. But let's just give an example of transportation. So, for example, Britain would be split a lot like the US, because the US, a lot of the structure was based originally in the UK. It's split into counties that look nothing like this. But there's Scotland, Wales, make sure we have our countries separate. But we have lots of counties here. And each of the counties had a transportation system controlled by the town council. Now, what happened with privatization is that third-party providers were allowed to bid for transportation routes in these councils. So what happened is you maybe had a company and they would win a certain council, and then they would win another council, and then they would win another council, and then they would win maybe a national coach service. So you actually had corporations, and they take over multiple areas. Now, the consequence of that is for consumers, they basically had more choice. They maybe had more, they had one transportation provider, they then had multiple transportation. So consumers had more choices. But unfortunately, for example, there was a lack of non-profitable routes. There's always a disadvantage. Anything that's advantage is a disadvantage. So if you lived in a little rural area, you might find your bus service cut. But for the companies, they built up large companies. And a few of these were Stagecoach and First Direct. Let's just move up a little bit. So we have Stagecoach and we have First Direct. Now, these companies were now pretty large, so these companies actually could expand to different countries. So I'm not even going to draw a map of the US. So, for example, Stagecoach actually took over some operations in the US. They took over some school buses, which were also being deregulated in the US, and they actually had a coach service. So if there's something called Megabus and Coach USA, I don't know if you've heard of these guys, those were actually part of Stagecoach. And Stagecoach also built operations in Europe and in Asia. Now, they actually just sold their US operations, but it shows how deregulation allowed these big corporations, competitive corporations, to form in the US, and then these corporations actually began to take over new markets in different countries. So that's my example for how deregulation actually helps globalization. And the final one is competitive forces. So this, I'm going to think about supermarkets. So we have Carrefour in France. We have Walmart in the US. And we have, let's just get me a full screen. So we have like Carrefour. We have Walmart. We have, for example, Tesco in the UK. We have Lidl and Aldi in Germany. And we have, I think I spelled it wrong, Ahold in the Netherlands. And basically, each of these supermarkets do well in the home market and then try and expand abroad. Tesco tried to expand to the US and failed, but they expanded to countries in Eastern Europe where they've been relatively successful. Walmart has tried to expand to Germany, but failed and was hit by, basically couldn't compete with Lidl and Aldi. Carrefour has expanded into South America and kind of francophone countries in Africa. So all these corporations are actually, you know, in this very global competitive environment, and they're fighting battles in different countries, almost like a world chessboard. So these competitive forces, we've got more trade, we've got these competitive battlegrounds. We have foreign ownership. For example, Walmart bought Asda, who they're selling. Tesco did a joint venture for supermarkets in the US. So we have this, you know, globalization of financial markets. Anybody anywhere in the world can buy Walmart stock on the US stock exchange, and anybody can buy Tesco stock on the stock exchange. We may have global competitors, so we may have, you know, the growth of online shopping. There may be a new competitor that kind of jumps ahead of these kind of local competitors. We may have a sudden internet grocery supermarket. We think that's what maybe Amazon is doing when they bought Whole Foods, is they were using it as a basis to have internet grocery shopping. And we have companies that are becoming more geocentric. They're thinking about the world as the market. They're forming alliances with other companies in different countries. They're forming joint ventures. So I think supermarkets was a really good example of competitive forces. Okay, so moving on a little bit. We talk a little bit more about global strategy. Despite globalization, you know, if I'm a company, I need to be good at something. So, for example, Walmart is very strong at cost leadership. We also have this idea about niche strategy and product differentiation. So let's stick with supermarkets. So cost leadership would be Walmart, or even, you know, they want to be the cheapest. Aldi would be another cost leadership. I think, you know, product differentiation and niche, it's very hard to separate them, because, you know, you're trying to have a niche strategy, you're trying to aim for a certain segment of the market, and you do it by differentiating your product. I think a nice example of this is Trader Joe's. And they found this, you know, niche of being quite trendy, quite environmentally friendly, quite healthy, but still being like relatively moderate prices. So they found their little kind of niche in the market. That would be an example of a niche strategy. Now, whenever we have a certain market, we need to think about the industry structure. So, I mean, the supermarket, I won't go through this again, the supermarket one I just gave you was actually a very nice example of that, a very nice example of a competitive market. Now, let's just think next about the relative power of certain players in the market, particularly buyers and suppliers. So the example again I'm going to give, I'm going to stick with like my supermarket example, because this is probably the best for this. And imagine if I'm a supplier, I'm a buyer, I'm Walmart, and I say, hey, you give me a cheaper price because I'm dominant, and if you don't give me a cheaper price, I'll get somebody else. I'll replace you with something else, and you'll lose a lot of your market. But, if I'm a supplier of, I say, potatoes, a farmer, I don't have a huge amount of bargaining power. So I probably have low bargaining power. But if I'm, say, Procter & Gamble selling Head and Shoulders, I've got some bargaining power. I can say, hey, I've got some very brand loyal consumers. If you don't sell Head and Shoulders, they're going to go to a different supermarket. So that's kind of like a good example of competitive environment. And the substitute products in my example, Walmart might say, okay, I'm going to have Pantene instead of Head and Shoulders. I'm not going to bother. And with the farmer, they could say, hey, I know there's another farmer who's going to sell me potatoes. Potatoes are potatoes. And again, we'd have potential entrants in the market. Maybe, I don't think, maybe, for example, if we're US supermarkets, we're kind of worried about some of these foreign discounters such as Lidl's, or we're worried about a new online grocery store. Okay, so that's kind of an example of competitive markets. Okay, so let's just give a few examples of how do we, global strategy and how do we get competitive advantage in the market. Okay, so there are various things we're going to discuss. So the first is first mover advantage versus first mover disadvantage. What's my first mover advantage on the market? Well, a first mover advantage is we kind of get ahead. So let's just stick with cars and let's just think about Tesla. Tesla are trying to build an infrastructure for electronic cars. So as I kind of build new cars and experience successes and failures, I get more and more experience. I'm getting market share. A lot of electronic cars sold are Teslas. I'm building up new technology and new patents. Tesla have had innovations with batteries. They've had innovations with like control systems for their cars. The disadvantage is the market might not be ready. It might be the fact that, Tesla build up all these technology and then GM or one of the, for example, Toyota eventually builds something similar to Tesla but at half the price, and they kind of grab the market. They just wait until the optimum time and then they get into the market. So a few examples of that is Xiaomi smartphones. This is a book example. Xiaomi smartphones in China, they were like the leading supplier of smartphones in China. But then these big international competitors came in and they weren't able to compete. Another interesting thing is credit cards. If I'm a finance supplier, like credit card supplier, I'm basically taking a risk on every single person I'm giving a credit card to. I look at their credit history, and I make a decision on how much money to give them. If I make that decision wrong, I'm going to lose a lot of money because I'm going to have a lot of bad debt. People aren't going to pay back. So maybe I'm a credit card supplier. I go into a new market and I end up a load of people get credit cards who can't pay me back, and I lose a load of money and I'm out of the market. But what I do, there's now been credit cards in this market, so maybe we've started to build up some credit checking infrastructure. So the next person along, the second mover, could kind of advantage from my problems. Another example, and I don't know if this is still in the book, this is from a previous version of the book, and this was a company that wanted to turn sugar beet into kind of electricity. And what they did is they like paid main sugar farmers to produce sugar beet for their factory, and try and then convert it into energy. The problem was is these sugar farmers were very conservative by nature. The first year they'd plant a little bit of sugar beet, next year they'd plant another field, eventually, and more. But the company was bankrupt by the time they could actually make a profit. So again, a second mover might have advantage here because the first mover has proved the concept but was just a little bit too early. Okay, so a few other things. We've got this idea of creative destruction. And this is a little bit too much economic terminology from the book. And monopoly means you're the leader in the market. Nobody can compete. Oligopoly, there's two main players in the market. Hyper-competition is the idea that we're in this huge competitive global environment, whatever industry I'm in, whether it's supermarkets, whether it's cars, whether it's smartphones, there can be a new player design something at any time and enter the market. So I have a certain technology, somebody's going to get a new technology. My example is Garmin. And GPSs were like the hot technology for a while. But suddenly smartphone manufacturers worked out how to incorporate GPSs into their smartphones. And suddenly GPSs were no longer hot technology. So we have a competitive advantage due to technology, but because of hyper competition, it's not liable to last. Okay, so not really a class discussion, but this is just an example of, 3D printing is the current big hot topic at the moment. And 3D Systems is a particular well-known 3D printing firm, which is growing very, very quickly. What's its competitive advantage? Well, its competitive advantage is it could probably, help small manufacturers who want to produce, small niche products from different markets, and we can do it much quicker than like a traditional manufacturer. So we've got a little niche. We've suddenly developed some competitive advantage, and we have a niche in the market. Okay, so the book talks a little bit about competitor versus consumer-oriented approach, and for this, I'll just stick with the book examples because the book is pretty good. So Black & Decker is a big international tools firm, and they were actually having competition from Makita, a Japanese firm, who were much more efficient than they were. And they managed to get products to global markets at reasonable prices. So what Black & Decker did is previously each region was like fighting with each other to develop new products. They globalized their product development. They focused on tools that would meet global product needs, and it's easier in some industries than in other industries. A drill does pretty much the same thing. Wherever you are in the world, a drill is a drill. That's not the same with, for example, food products, where culture can be quite different. And they focused on global needs, and they've grown from, I think it was 5.4 billion to about 100 billion in sales over a 15-year period. Estee Lauder, they have a very consumer-focused approach. The Estee Lauder, if you don't know, they have skincare, makeup, fragrances. They put a lot of emphasis on consumers, so getting consumer feedback, having consumer focus groups, having consumer panels. They're always trying to think what the consumer is feeling and what's the latest trends are going to be. Now, in a way, any company needs to be both consumer focused and competitor focused. So I'm not going to give a multiple choice question and say, is it consumer focused or competitor focused? Because there is really a trade-off here. And again, if for an in-class exercise, well, obviously we can't do that this semester, but I'd kind of give some common brands and ask you to say whether you think, I might do this for the homework, whether you think it's going to be more competitor or customer focused. And we could do a little bit of analysis on that. Okay, so now we're just going to talk and we're just going to tidy things up. We're going to talk a little bit more about global strategy. So we've already talked a little bit about hyper competition. I talked the advantage of creative destruction. But we can also talk a little bit about interdependency. Modern industry is very interdependent. A lot of companies, a lot of our supply chain problems in March were because factories in China shut down and the whole supply chain relied on production in China, and that caused problems in the system. Another example, for example, smartphones. Apple rely very much on the Android operating system, which is made by Samsung, which is a Korean company. And a lot of the chips and a lot of the core products will be produced in China. So you can't just say, okay, I've got an Apple iPhone, it's an American thing, because there's going to be a global supply chain and your Apple iPhone will have kind of incorporate components from different parts of the world. So, and again, we've talked about how the world's become more globalized, but things like, trade, things like the recent tariff war between the US and China, these do actually affect your strategy. A lot of quite a bit of manufacturing over the last year has moved from China to other low-cost providers such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia because of the tariffs. So governments still play a role in international industry. Okay, so on to section 3.